Cool. Hello, I'm Siobhan Cooke-Miller and I'm Archaeology Curator here in Orkney Museum. So welcome to the Viking and Late Norse galleries in the museum. These galleries were redeveloped as part of a major project that was funded by a very generous bequest. So we have two galleries in the museum that are focusing on the Viking Age and the Late Norse period in Orkney, spanning the period from the 9th century through to 1468, which is the closing of political ties with Norway when Orkney was transferred to the Scottish Crown. And the galleries cover a wide range of themes, from arrival by sea, ships and shipbuilding, the earliest settlement evidence in Orkney, pagan Viking burials, farming, fishing, trade, and runic inscriptions, just to name a few. So I've been given some questions that I'm going to answer, so we are going to dive in. So the first question was, what is the most surprising myth or legend about the Picts or Vikings in Orkney that isn't widely known? One of the really big questions about the Vikings' arrival in Orkney is what happened to the late Iron Age population who were living here, the Pictish people. And that question of what happened to the Picts when the Vikings arrived has been the subject of debate for a very long time. Some people have argued that the Picts were wiped out by the Vikings, and others have argued for a more peaceful assimilation of the Pictish people into the new Norse society. What we do know is that interaction would have been complex, but much more research is needed to understand the relationship between the Picts and the incoming Norse in Orkney. But related to that is thinking about where we find the earliest evidence for the Vikings coming to Orkney. So when the Vikings arrive in Orkney, they don't start building longhouses straight away. What they actually do, and the archaeological evidence shows us, is that they choose initially to reuse existing Pictish farms and estates. And they would have chosen these sites because they had access to agricultural and maritime resources. And the galleries look at this topic and the reuse of these Iron Age and Pictish sites. Sites include Poole and Sandy, so we have evidence of the Viking reuse and settlement at that site. And they're not just living in these sites, they're also reusing them for burial. So, for example, the Broch of Gurnus in Evie and Buckroy in Bursey have all been reused by the Vikings for burial, and you can see artefacts from those sites throughout the galleries. So moving on to the second question. Are there any recent discoveries that have changed what we thought we knew about Pictish or Viking history in Orkney? And that's a really big question. But new archaeological discoveries are continually adding to our understanding of the period. So new finds and excavations continually generate new information. For example, there's work ongoing at scale in Rousey. Excavations are led by the Archaeology Institute at the University of the Highlands and Islands, and they've made some really exciting discoveries in recent years. A number of really important excavations are also being brought to publication at the moment, and that includes the earldom property of Earl's Boo in Ulster. And we get a lot of really exciting information coming out of those excavations. Earl's Boo, for example, this is talked about within the gallery, has evidence for gold and the processing of precious metals. And that's quite rare. That's rare even in an urban context. So to find this evidence in Orkney, and the first evidence of this in Orkney, is really exciting. And of course, new scientific techniques continually generate new information. And this is really important for museums. You know, these new scientific techniques can be applied to museum collections. which just highlights the importance of collections and care by museums and that new information that can be gleaned from them. So whenever you think about why museums have boxes of pottery and animal bones and fish bone in their stores, it's a valuable for research in the future. The third question then. So can you share a story or artifact that challenges a common misconception about the Vikings? There are lots of misconceptions about the Vikings, including that they were called the Vikings. So that's not an ethnic label. They didn't refer to themselves as Vikings. This is really a description of what they did, so referring to the act of raiding. But other misconceptions would include that they were filthy and unkept. And the galleries include artefacts that certainly bust that misconception. The Vikings actually took very good care of their hygiene, and we find evidence of this archaeologically through finds of personal hygiene equipment. And one of the most common finds in settlements and in the pagan burials is hair combs. And we have many examples of hair combs on display throughout both of the galleries. And they're very personal possessions. And we have many fine examples. They could be decorated, so might have ring and dot motifs or incised lines. But we also find very decorative and ornate and complexly decorated examples as well. And they're also one of the items that are being imported into Orkney in the Viking Age and Late Norse period. One of the other biggest misconceptions is that, and stereotypes, is of the Vikings as raiders. And while that, of course, did happen, we have in written sources such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the Ulster Chronicles, accounts of raiding happening throughout the coast of the British Isles. But that would have only been a small percentage of the population, and actually most Vikings would have been farmers. And they also fished. They were skilled craftspeople, so making very fine metalwork and wood carving. And they're also merchants, so involved in large trade networks. So much more than just the stereotypical raiders. And again, this is all attested to and covered within the galleries and the objects that we have on display. So we have weights that are used in trade. We have exotic artifacts come in through these large trade networks, such as amber. We also have objects made of steatite and soapstone. The Vikings are aceramic, so they're not using pottery. They actually have a preference for steatite, this soft mineral that they use for a variety of types of objects, including cooking vessels, spindle whorls, fishing weights. And this is imported into Orkney, so we don't have a naturally occurring steatite resource. This is being brought from Shetland and from Norway. So we have all of these different artefacts on display talking about this and challenging these misconceptions. So the fourth question then, are there any overlooked roles that women played in Pictish or Viking societies in Orkney? Women were really important in Norse society, and they played a number of different roles. Such roles included in textile production, and that's very important, textile production, for a variety of reasons. But it's very important in the sphere of trade, which meant women held an important role within the economy. Women could also hold important and powerful positions in terms of land ownership, and one such woman is mentioned in the Orkney Inga saga, and that is Ragna, who's the namesake of our AI Viking in room 6. And the saga tells us that she owned estates in North Rothesay and Papa Westry, so she was a prominent landholder in those islands. And other roles that women played could also be in sorcery. So the role of the vulva, who is a powerful seeress who can see into the future. So lots of roles, and these again are featured and spoken to within the galleries. So my fifth question then, how do modern Arcadians connect with their Viking heritage? And I think this happens in lots of different ways, and it's going to be different for everybody. In Orkney, we are surrounded by the legacy of our Norse past. We are surrounded by Norse place names, so that's a good example there. When we look at different island names, so for example, Sandy comes from the Old Norse for sand island. Hoy comes from high island. Westry is West Island. So they feature in the place names. Other place names include Scale. So for example, Scale in Sandwich, that comes from Scali, so it denotes a high status settlement. We also have place names such as Tingwall in Dingieshow, and they're interesting in that they have what we call the thing element in their place names, and that's a legal place name. It denotes a place of assembly. So again, if we think back to stereotypes about the Vikings and the Norse actually had a huge respect for the law and had their own legal system, which centred around these assemblies or thing sites. And Dingieshow is also interesting because it also has the how element, which is mound. So Dingieshow means thing mound. So, it's all around us in our place names. But we're also surrounded by the visible reminders in the landscape as well, from, the graffiti in Maze How, and, our magnificent cathedral in Kirkwall, St Magnus Cathedral, which was founded in 1137 and dedicated to St Magnus, who was one of the Earls of Orkney in the 12th century. And all of these aspects, again, are covered within and throughout the exhibitions. And of course, our benefactor, who made the redevelopment of these galleries possible with a very generous gift in his will. And he perhaps chose to connect to his heritage by leaving that very generous gift with the purposes of redeveloping this gallery and sharing Orkney's Viking and Norse past with all of those who visit the museum, and we are very grateful to him for this amazing opportunity. So my sixth question then, if you could ask a Viking visitor from the past one question, what would it be? That's a really hard question. As an academic, I have very maybe niche research interests. So I might ask a question about funerary ritual, but again that's very specific to my own research. But a very exciting feature within the galleries is that visitors have the opportunity to ask a Viking any question that they like. So we have Ragna in the galleries, and Ragna is a fully interactive, historically accurate AI character. She's a 9th century Norse landholder, merchant and vulva, who is living in Orkney in 897 AD. And what makes this interactive unique is that she's fully conversational and unscripted. So this means that visitors can have natural, organic and unique conversations with her. So she's not limited to pre-recorded answers or responses or dialogue, and she uses a large language model to generate natural and intelligent responses based on what visitors ask her. And that's radically different from any other AI interactive in museums. And in fact, Ragna is believed to be the first fully unscripted, public-facing AI character in a UK museum exhibit, and potentially even the world, as there isn't actually a well-known one to date. And as well as having these conversations, for facial expressions, gestures, and voice all respond dynamically to guests in real time. So come and ask Ragnar any questions that you might have. 7th question then. So what's the strangest or funniest legend featured in the exhibition? Well, the exhibits and content are based on what we know archaeologically and from the various written sources. But what is also included in the exhibition is excerpts from the Orkney saga. So the Orkney saga is one of the Icelandic sagas. It was written in Iceland in the 13th century by an unnamed author. And it recounts the myths and history of the Earls of Orkney over 3 centuries. So it gives us a huge wealth of information about the politicking of the Earls and of important events that took place around 900 to 1200 AD. So as part of the exhibition, we have an audio interactive where we have selected 5 narratives from the saga that you can pick up a speaker and choose a story to listen to. And these have been read and recorded by our former exhibitions officer, Tom Muir, who is recently retired, but is also a very well-known storyteller. And of those 5 narratives, I think my favourite has to be the one about Sigurd the Stout and his raven banner. So Sigurd the Stout is the last pagan Earl of Orkney. And in this narrative, he's challenged to a battle. And he goes and consults his mother, who's a very powerful and skilled seeress and skilled in magic. And she makes him a magic banner. And she tells him, "My belief is this, that it will bring victory to the man it has carried before, but death to the one that carries it." And the saga tells us that this is a very finely made banner, and on it is the image of a raven. During this battle, Sigurd loses 3 standard bearers, but he wins the battle. So do come and have a listen to that if you're in the museum. What new objects are on display? So we have a lot of old favourites that have been on display previously, but we also have some new acquisitions that have come into the collection. One group of objects comes from a longhouse that was excavated a number of years ago in Sandwich. So we've got a lovely comb, a beautiful white bead with blue swags, and also a lovely ringed pin, as well as many other objects that have come from Snusgar. We also have some artefacts that have been recently allocated to the museum through the treasure trove process. And that includes a lovely runic inscribed bone spindle whorl that was a chance find and reported by a member of the public. So lots of new things for people to see. Have you borrowed any artefacts from other museums? So yes, we aren't just displaying our own collections, we have also borrowed objects. And one of the highlights, I think, has to be this sword behind me here. And this is on loan to the museum from the Pitt Rivers collection at Salisbury Museum. And this was excavated in the 19th century. It's from a very large Viking or pagan Norse cemetery in the island of Westray. And at the time this was excavated, it was then sold to a private collector called Bateman. And upon his death, his whole collection of artefacts that he'd collected over time was auctioned, and Pitt Rivers purchased this sword, and then it ended up in the collection at the Salisbury Museum. So this is the first time this object pict has actually been back to Orkney since its discovery in 1839. So really exciting opportunity for people to see this for the first time in Orkney. And again, we're very thankful for the legacy left by our benefactor to enable us to secure these objects on loan. So my final question is, what objects are not to be missed in the gallery? There's lots to see in the gallery, and it would be very hard to choose a favourite, but I think it would have to be the Scar plaque. This is a magnificently carved whalebone plaque from a boat burial in Sandy, and there aren't many examples of these whalebone plaques surviving. There's only around 60 known across the whole of the Viking world, and most of those are fragmentary. So there are only a couple that are complete. And the example from Scar is probably the best. So I will wrap up there, but thank you and goodbye.